Good morning and welcome to the Saturday edition of my live comments. You see, when we look around, we see an all-pervasive atmosphere of grief and loss. But all grief is not the same. And when we say people are grief-stricken, the grief even of a single tragedy may be of a different nature to different people. Quite possible, suppose there are 7 people who are victims of the same tragedy, but the grief of all the 7 can be different, though some of the categories might overlap each other. And understanding the variety and the types of grief is important so that proper counseling can be provided, keeping in view what sort of grief it is. Many times the grief is of a nature that no counseling is required, but it would differ from place to place. We have seen many times that the people who come to grieve with you often start saying things which increase your pain and agony. It's not that those people are really bad. It's because they do not understand the variety of grief that you are suffering from, the kind of grief you are suffering from. Everybody grieves in his or her unique way. And you grieve in your way because your grief is different than those of around you. And at times, you may be absolutely unaware of what you are grieving about, what you have suffered, and whether you suffered the loss which you deserve. After grief is but a reaction to a loss, the loss can be of person, the loss can be of property, the loss can be of an emotion, but grief would be different. And this loss, primarily the grief is when the human life is lost, or when the human beings lose their physical or cognitive abilities, or the loss of something that was routine, even a job loss can be a cause of grief. In addition to emotional expression of grief, it can be expressed in physical, behavioral, social, and cognitive ways. So some of the varieties of the grief, there are hundreds of varieties, but then let's concentrate on major one of them. One is the normal grief. It is your ability. And this grief is a very, very potent form of grief because this grief, normal grief, is some sort of an antidote to the loss. And it enables you to move forward to accept the loss. With this comes a gradual decrease in the intensity of emotion. So this is not much to be worried about. Another one is anticipatory grief. And even this grief, people are prepared for. Say somebody close to you, some senior, some elderly guy, for whom you are caring for, has got a disease, an illness, which you go, no, is traumatic, but it's going to be fatal. There is no hope of survival. So you anticipate that the death is going to be there, the loss is going to be there. And the grief starts the moment that diagnosis is made. It can be difficult to speak with others about the anticipatory grief because the target of the grief, the person about whom you are feeling bad, is still alive. And many times if you talk about that grief, you may have feelings of guilt or confusion as to why you are feeling the grief. The person is still alive. Who knows, there might be a miracle. So in such sort of a grief, if you start going to a person and tell him, look here, I feel bad for you, would rather heighten the grief rather than decrease it. The third is the delayed grief. You see, this grief is a reaction when the emotions set in after the long time. It's a later, after the incident has happened. And this type of grief may be in life event or something even unrelated. Say your granddad died. You felt some grief, but in case there is another tragedy, that first grief will come back. So it's a delayed grief. And many times you do not understand that delayed grief is a reason of being so emotional. The most dangerous is traumatic grief, complicated grief, or prolonged grief. When the normal grief becomes so severe in longevity and impairs your ability to function, this is traumatic grief. It's a trauma. And this is a major issue that has to be taken up. This traumatic grief can result in self-destructive behavior, persistence of a feeling of guilt, loss of self-esteem, suicidal thoughts, violent outbursts, radical life changes. Quite possible you might be an extrovert and you become an introvert. You are an introvert and you might become extrovert to cover that complicated grief. That there's another grief which I would call disenfranchised grief. This is very ambiguous. This grief is felt when someone experiences a loss, but others do not acknowledge the importance of the loss in the person's life. Others may not understand the importance of the loss, or they minimize the importance of the loss. It can occur. Say, I'm giving an extreme examples. You are divorced and your ex-spouse dies, or a pet dies, or a co-worker dies. Then this is a disenfranchised grief. And that's what happens. Say a class fellow dies, and then you feel grief. And this is basically disenfranchised grief because you are personally not involved. Many times, the person you are caring for, say, has dementia or lack of physical disabilities. The person is physically present, but is absent in many ways. So this is an ambiguous, you are caring. Now this is basically a part of the traumatic grief and also of the unconnected grief. The person who is closely related, the spouse, the child, they are having trauma. Others come and go away. Temporarily they might have a feeling, but then that's not grief for them. You see, like complicated grief, there's another variety which is very dangerous. That's chronic grief. This can be experienced in many ways: hopelessness, state of disbelief that this could have happened. And at times, people with a chronic belief experience intrusive thoughts. If left untreated, chronic grief can result in severe clinical depression, suicide, or even substance abuse. They might go and become a drug addict. So, as I said earlier, complicated grief and chronic grief need counseling, not disenfranchised grief. I'm many times amazed that the tragedy takes place in a school and the whole attention is on providing counseling. That rather heightens the sense of grief because you are not letting time heal. The healing by the time is much more important than the human intervention by the counselors. I'm amazed when the psychologists behave in that manner. Then there's one called cumulative grief. That happens. You have one tragedy, then the second tragedy, then the third tragedy, third loss, fourth loss. And that is very stressful because you do not have the time to properly grieve one loss before you experience the next loss. I remember my wife's uncle died, and within a week, his young son, hardly in 30s, he died. For the family, the mother, the elder brother, the sister, this was a cumulative grief, and that can be very, very stressful. Then there's a masked grief, covered grief, which you don't talk about. Sometimes people grieve and they don't know why they're grieving. They know in the heart of their heart that something is wrong. And that masked grief can be negative behavior. That can be seen in that. The worst is the exaggerated grief. And this is very common in the emotional society. And this grief, exaggerated grief, is more for the show of the people than for your real emotions. This grief has got to be discouraged as by simply shaking off. Don't care. Because they are just the parasites preying on your emotions. Then there is a distorted grief. It can be present with a feeling of guilt, anger, change of behavior, hostility towards a particular person. Say somebody, you'll have a loss of some dear and dear one, and you think that the third person has caused that loss. So you have a distorted grief. The loss is there, but the attention goes from the person who has lost, who is lost, to the person who caused the loss. Then, there's inhibited grief. The people who are not very social, when they suffer a loss, they are inhibited. They keep their grief to themselves. They do not cry. Even the tears that they shed are very silent. And it is because they pose as stoics, but they are not. And many times there are secondary losses. Secondary losses are that somebody related to you far off, not immediate, is lost. And you feel that loss by association. And then, it's a collective grief. A national figure dies. A sportsman dies. So, you are not affected. But because the community is there, is being affected, it becomes a sort of a collective grief. A terrorist attack. Now, you are grieving not because you have lost, but because you fear that you could have been there. This is akin to the feeling of poetic tragedy, what Aristotle calls, or the feeling of tragedy. You have a feeling that you could have been a victim, but you are not, you are safe. Then there is abbreviated grief, very short period. Say you go to a funeral, at that time you feel bad, what a loss of life. You come back and immediately you forget it. So this is easiest part to get over. And then there is absent grief. It comes when someone does not acknowledge a loss and shows no sign of grief, but it can result in complete shock. As a matter of fact, absent grief is psychologically very damaging. So this is the variety, the vast variety of the types of grief. And you have first, when you want to counsel somebody, when you want to sympathize with somebody, the most important is you first understand what sort of the grief the person is suffering from. Say a person is suffering from abbreviated grief, and you start then go commiserating with him. well, I'm so sorry it happened, and God bless, and this should not have happened, all that. The man is going to become, the person, I mean the man or the woman, is going to become irritated. So your whole purpose would be defeated. Similarly, exaggerated grief, you want to sympathize with somebody. Masked grief, somebody doesn't want to show, and you're prodding him. So you have got to identify and be sure what the grief is. And after you have identified the purpose and the cause of the grief, then if you start having a sympathetic or empathetic behavior with that person who has suffered that grief, then it can be useful. Otherwise, many times, so-called sympathy is self-defeating. It can have negative results, and that must be avoided. I have seen many times that the people who go to sympathize rather worsen the situation rather than improve it. So that's why it's important to know the variety, and you should know how to distinguish that grief. Once you know what sort of grief the person is suffering from, it will be very easy for you to establish a bridge and communicate effectively and ensure that the person comes out of his grief in a proper manner. Thank you.